Kirby Smart was talking about Georgia's wide receiver room on Tuesday, and it started to get me thinking because he talked about how, we might not have like one superstar, but we spread the ball around. And it's true because if you look at Georgia's stats, not just over the last few years during kind of this era of football, they have always spread the ball around. And there's not usually like one or two really, really dominant guys, and there aren't 1,000-yard receivers, right? They don't produce these like superstar skill position players, that at least not from a production standpoint, right? Obviously, George Pickens was a star. Brock Bowers is a superstar. James Cook, Zamir White, those guys, good, right? But the years that Georgia won the national championship were very different than most of the teams. I've got all of the numbers pulled up from the last decade, starting with 2013 with Florida State. And there's only one other team over the course of the last decade plus-ish that won a national championship in a similar capacity as Georgia from a true team standpoint, from a true this defense is really, really good. This offense is really, really good. There's not one guy or two guys that we're just feeding the ball to, right? We've got all sorts of football players that can beat you. And from top to bottom, this football team won the national championship. Georgia did that in 2021 and 2022, right? There was not a single player that had some insane statistical season. I think Zamir White and James Cook both ended up with around 1,000 scrimmage yards when you add their receiving and their rushing. But outside of that, right, but Bowers was getting 800 something, and Lai McConkey had 400 yards, and Jermaine Burton, right? They had their stats, team effort, right? And Michigan this past year had kind of a statistical anomaly type of player. So I'm going to run through these, right? I'll run through Florida State, Ohio State, all the championship teams the last few years. How are they different from what Georgia is building, what Georgia is? Not what they're building. I retract. Not what Georgia's building, what Georgia has become and what Kirby Smart has made Georgia, this football team. Top to bottom, just we're going to beat you, right? There's not just one guy that's going to beat you. Ryan Curley from Dawg Post here, talking about how Georgia wins national championships a little bit outside of the norm in terms of stats. All right, I've got them all pulled up. Let's talk about it. Let's get into it. Florida State. Oh, man. We're at the point where I'm looking at the ESPN stats for this, and we're at the point where like their face cards are they're just grayed out, right? They don't have pictures. Jameis Winston won the Heisman. Right, so there's that. Obviously, that's kind of the easy part about it. But they had multiple 1,000-yard receivers in Rashad Green. Remember Rashad Green? And they had a Kelvin Benjamin who had 1,000 yards and 15 receiving touchdowns. So that's more than a touchdown per game for Kelvin Benjamin. Had a 1,000-yard rusher in Devontae Freeman. But obviously, right, having Jameis Winston throw for 4,000 yards and 40 touchdowns, that was kind of your outlier right there. Well, Carson Beck this past year, 3,900 yards, only 24 touchdowns, right? So Jameis Winston had a really big year for them. They had a Heisman winner. Ohio State, so the first college football playoff, right? Oh, this Ohio State team, it was the only, a 4-seed wins, and, it was the first time that there wasn't just two teams. They had an absolute bona fide superstar that was putting up superstar numbers in Ezekiel Elliott. 1,800 yards and 18 touchdowns on the ground that year, and he was a beast in the college football playoff, right? I mean, just dominated. I mean, had a big game against Alabama and Oregon in those two games. So they had a guy like that was just like that. Now, don't take what I'm saying is Georgia does not have superstars. I'm just saying that they beat you in different ways. And look, Brock Bowers is a superstar, right? And he was on both those national championship teams. He just wasn't producing at like this insane level, right? Because we know Brock Bowers is capable of producing more than what he actually did. But that's not the type of ball that Georgia plays. Alabama 2015. One of the biggest statistical anomalies on here, right? I'm going to give you 3 seconds to think about it if you haven't gotten it yet. 3, 2, 1. Derrick Henry, Heisman winner. Derrick Henry, 2,200 yards and 28 touchdowns on the ground, right? Can you remember who the quarterback was? It was Jake Coker. But they had a beast in Derrick Henry that carried them through the end of that season, really dominated for them. And, along with the Calvin Ridley, who had a really good year. 2016, Well, Deshaun Watson was definitely a Heisman finalist that year. This is kind of the one where it's not quite as much, but Mike Williams, 1,300 yards, 11 touchdowns. They fed him for sure. Deshaun Watson, 4,500 yards, 41 touchdowns. So this one is not the best example for what I'm talking about, but they still have guys that are putting up like 1,000-yard seasons, and they're relying on a couple of stars, right? Wayne Gallman had 1,100 yards and 17 touchdowns. That's a big year. 2017 is where you find the example that is just like Georgia. If I could get the right thing pulled up, because I actually had 2018 pulled up. The 2017 Alabama team that beat the Georgia Bulldogs, that had statistical outliers in Nick Chubb and Sony Michel. This Alabama team, Damian Harris, 1,000 yards, 8 and 11 touchdowns. Calvin Ridley, 967 yards, 5 touchdowns. Henry Ruggs had 6 touchdowns that year. Right, Devontae Smith, the guy that scored the game-winning touchdown, had 8 catches the entire year. That Alabama defense was really good that year. That Alabama offense had a lot of really good players, and they didn't beat you in one way. They literally had 2 quarterbacks play in that game. So talking about some bad memories for Georgia fans, but the 2017 Alabama team is definitely the most similar to Georgia and the way they've done it in this case. 2018, no, because guess what? Travis Etienne ran for 1,600 yards and 24 touchdowns, and they had 2 guys near 1,000 yards and 20 touchdowns. Trevor Lawrence, very efficient year. 2019 Alabama, or 2020 Alabama. I didn't even pull up 2019 LSU. All right, that's just breaking statistical records everywhere. Right, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Joe Burrow. But then you move on. Crazy year. Najee Harris. They had 3 of the 5 Heisman finalists. 1,400 yards and 26 touchdowns for Najee Harris. 1,800 yards and 23 touchdowns for Devontae Smith. Mac Jones threw for 4,500 yards and 41 touchdowns. They were ridiculous from a statistical standpoint. And then you get to the Georgia Bulldogs going back-to-back, and they don't have any of that. But they've got Zamir running for 850 yards. James Cook running for 700 yards. You've got 1, 2, 3 receivers with over 400 yards, Bowers with over 800, and then you got James Cook. Like they went all over the place for this. Obviously, more than one quarterback played that year. Beating teams by a committee. All right, and I hope you enjoy. I really enjoyed going through those numbers. I felt like I was really going through all my college football memories of just the last decade. I didn't want to do kind of more than 10 years, right? Auburn, 2010 was another good one. Right? Why did Auburn win? Because Cam Newton had an insane, ridiculous, all sorts of words you can call it, season statistically, where Auburn dominated. And Georgia doesn't do that. Right? That Alabama team in 2017 is the only time. 2022, right? Because I told you I'd give you more than one. Well, Bowers has a really good year, right? 942 and 7 touchdowns, but you get 700 out of Ladd. You get 500 out of Kenny McIntosh. You get almost 500 out of Darnell Washington. 300 out of Marcus Jones-Jackson. Kenny McIntosh is running for 800 yards. Kendall Milton's running for 500. Branson Robinson's running for 300. Dejan Edwards is running for 700. Stetson Bennett was a Heisman finalist, but his numbers are not as good as any of the other Heisman finalists that we talked about, or Heisman winners that we talked about, with 4,100 yards through the air, 27 touchdowns. Stetson did have, 10 on the ground, right? So he was kind of a little bit of a difference maker there, but still closer to what it was for Georgia in 2021 in terms of how they just went all over the place for their production and beat people. Really just wanted to share kind of the unique way that Georgia has been winning. And it was the same way in 2023 last year when Georgia was a contender, right? Who ends up winning? Michigan, right? Closer. Definitely a committee in terms of receiving when you go through and look at their receiving numbers. But they had a superior rushing attack where they had a lead horse who had a crazy statistical season, 1,200 yards and 27 touchdowns for Blake Corum. Georgia does it in a different way without having one guy shine. And it kind of reminds me of something Kirby Smart said. If you don't care who gets the credit, then you will succeed. Botching his quote a little bit, but it's basically what he said. Thanks for watching.